here. I've met a number of you, but I am Meredith Parfit, and I'm the CEO of a crisis management firm. So we work on capital C crisis. Not a bad hair day, not a bad tweet, but like fraud, scandal, misconduct, all of the things that you hope you're never going to get into. So just a little bit of background. I spent most of my career in finance. Did an MBA, sit on a number of boards, have worked in hedge funds, private equity, venture capital, and I always say that the blah 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 of your resume has nothing to do with what's ever happened to you. My story isn't about what I've done, it's about what happened and then the things I learned over most of the last of the 2 decades. So I was a couple of weeks into business school, and my younger sister died of an overdose. It was early in the opioid crisis, almost 20 years ago. We didn't even know they were dangerous at that point. And I was in a pretty competitive place, and I had to get up. I had to go back to school, and I had to take accounting classes, and most of the time, I could barely put my shoes on. My family was crippled with grief. I never had anything bad happen to me, probably ever. And then one day I just woke up and had to learn how to cope. And so I did what I thought was perfectly normal. I got obsessed with death and dying. I'm sure that's what everyone does. I started taking classes and reading books about death. And I would do death yoga. And I even at one point tried to lay like a corpse for like 10 minutes because they had told you that that was the way to get in touch with your mortality. So anything weird you can think of around death and dying, I've done it. Even we were at the 4 Mile Historic, some of us were at that dinner, and there was a plaque on the wall made of human hair. And I said, oh, that's a Victorian death ritual. My partner was like, oh my God, why do you know these things? So suffice it to say, I just kept going on a path of exploration around death and dying. Shortly after my sister died, both of my grandmothers died. So my parents each lost a parent and a child in a 6-month period. One of my cousins died. A couple years after that, I was in childbirth with my first son. Routine C-section, no big deal. Doctor cut one of my arteries and sewed me back up. And as they're wheeling me into the operating room nearly 8 hours later, I'm coded, and I look at the doctors and I say, you can't do this to my parents. They're not gonna live through this. So I spent a lot of time reconsidering death over and over and over again, asking them, why is this happening to me? And as a part of that, in 2016, I started volunteering for hospice. I loved it. It was like sitting with the dying, looking across the veil, being like, what do you see? What's over there? I couldn't figure it out. So I liked that, and I kept going, and I became a death doula, which is just like death supercharged. And then I liked that so much, I went back and got a master's degree at a small seminary here in Denver, and became a hospice chaplain. So I still work a couple shifts a month with the dying. I worked a shift yesterday before I came down here for the dinner. Chaplains are trained in grief, trauma, loss, hard things, hard conversations. We work mainly in secular settings, and so there's a lot of crisis involved in working with the dying and with the grieving families. In parallel to all of this, I was inside of a hedge fund. I had worked in and out of different funds for most of my career. I was the COO. I was getting a root canal. And you know, you probably won't do this. When you're at the dentist, you lay your phone like this, just in case you miss something. So it starts like vibrating off the hook. And I'm laying there and I look up like this, and our largest investment in the fund had just been raided by the FBI. It wasn't our fraud, we didn't know about the fraud, but it kicked off a series of catastrophic losses for our investors, losses for our fund. It was a $500 million global Ponzi scheme, and there were hundreds of investors. The bad guys went to jail for decades. The fallout was pretty radical. It shut our fund down, and there were many, many years of cleanup. And at one point, for the the lawyers in the room, you might appreciate this. I was crying to my lawyer, saying, this is the worst thing ever. And he says to me, and I'm sure none of the lawyers in the room would ever do this, he says, get fucking over it. It's not like somebody died. Okay. So the problem is it felt like someone died. And I was no stranger to grief at that point. Like, this wasn't something I'd never done before. It wasn't a place I'd never been. It was familiar territory. I felt like I'd lost my reputation. I'd lost friends. I'd lost community. I'd lost a sense of safety. I had no kind of historical basis for criminality. All these losses felt like grief. But the difference was I'd been practicing grief for a long time, and I'd been practicing loss for a long time, and I kind of knew what death and near death felt like. And so everything we're going to talk about today are the learnings that emerged out of these experiences of loss, and about the convergence of ways that we grieve, ways that we suffer, ways that we lose things in professional settings, in personal settings. We always hear the phrase, work-life balance. There's no such thing. We are human, and we live as humans in every single setting that we exist in. And so these are a set of tools that hopefully will help you personally or professionally, because inevitably in every life there is some form of suffering. So the first thing we need to do is